November 8, 1942, 2 hours past midnight. The Atlantic swells heaved against the hull of the USS Massachusetts as her 16-inch guns fell silent. Along the Moroccan coast, the phosphorescence in the breaking waves cast an eerie green glow against the darkness. Major Friedrich Decker of the Wehrmacht Advisory Corps stood on the balcony of the Casablanca Port Authority building, binoculars pressed to his face, watching something he had been trained to believe was impossible. American troops, untested, unprepared, barely a year into their war, were executing a night amphibious assault across multiple beaches simultaneously. The air smelled of cordite and salt. In the distance, landing craft engines growled through the dark like hunting animals. Decker lowered his binoculars slowly, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from the first whisper of doubt. For 3 years, the German General Staff had maintained a careful assessment of American military capability. Their reports, circulated through OKW headquarters in Berlin and filed in leather binders marked Streng Geheim, painted a consistent picture. The Americans were industrialists, not warriors. They could build ships and airplanes, yes, mountains of them, but they lacked the Prussian discipline, the battle-hardened experience, the ideological fire that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe. Night operations in particular were considered a European specialty, refined through centuries of continental warfare. The Americans, the report suggested, would fight like they lived, loudly, wastefully, in broad daylight, with overwhelming material superiority substituting for tactical sophistication. They would never master the subtle art of darkness. This assumption was not born from ignorance, but from experience. German forces had perfected night fighting during the Great War, in the trenches where darkness meant survival. By 1939, night maneuvers were standard Wehrmacht doctrine. Troops trained in blackout conditions, navigating by compass and star, communicating through whispered commands and hand signals, refined over generations of military tradition. The Blitzkrieg relied on daylight, yes, but the German army owned the night through discipline and rehearsal. When Wehrmacht officers reviewed American training films and intelligence reports in early 1942, they saw troops who drilled in sunshine, who relied on radios that squawked and crackled, who moved with the mechanical coordination of factory workers rather than the fluid silence of soldiers. The conclusion seemed obvious: give the Americans sunlight and steel, and they might overwhelm you. Meet them in darkness, and they would stumble blind. But what Friedrich Decker witnessed that November night along the Moroccan shore was not stumbling. It was a choreography of controlled violence that seemed to defy everything he understood about untested armies. The landing craft arrived in waves, their timing precise despite the darkness and the surf. Troops disembarked and moved inland with unexpected speed, their formations adapting to obstacles Decker could barely perceive through his binoculars. There was noise, yes, the Americans were never quiet, but beneath the noise was structure. Tracer fire from covering positions arced in coordinated patterns. Mortar illumination rounds burst at seemingly predetermined intervals, casting moving shadows across the beach approaches. Naval gunfire fell exactly where it was needed, then shifted as the infantry advanced. This was not chaos, this was orchestration. The German military attachés who observed Operation Torch compiled their reports with growing unease. The Americans had landed 35,000 troops across 3 Moroccan beachheads in a single night, supported by a naval task force that navigated across the Atlantic in complete radio silence, arriving at the precise coordinates at the exact hour planned. The scale alone was staggering. Germany had never attempted a night amphibious operation of such magnitude, but scale was expected from America. What unsettled the analysts was the precision. Documents captured later revealed the depth of planning, tide tables calculated to the minute, naval gunfire support coordinated with beach landing schedules. Even the phases of the moon factored into the assault timing. The Americans had treated the night not as an obstacle to overcome through courage and discipline, but as a problem to be solved through systematic preparation. In the weeks that followed, as American forces pushed into Tunisia and began their first sustained combat against German troops, Wehrmacht field commanders encountered something else unexpected. The Americans learned at terrifying speed. After early setbacks at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where German tactical superiority briefly validated old assumptions, the American response was not retreat into daylight operations, but an almost obsessive analysis of failure. Units that had broken under night counterattacks returned weeks later with new procedures, new signals, new coordination between infantry and artillery. They made the same mistakes once, sometimes twice, but rarely 3 times. German after-action reports began noting a disturbing pattern. American night patrols were becoming aggressive, probing, learning the contours of German defensive positions with methodical patience. By spring 1943, it was American patrols that controlled no man's land after dark. What the German officers had misjudged was not American courage, they had never doubted that, but American approach. The Wehrmacht had built its night fighting capability on tradition and discipline, on soldiers trained to obey without question, to execute rehearsed movements in darkness through sheer repetition. The Americans built theirs on something different, distributed initiative. They equipped every squad with radios when German squads still relied on runners. They trained junior officers to make independent decisions when German lieutenants waited for orders from above. They created improvised solutions in the field, soldiers taping luminous strips to the backs of helmets so men could follow each other in darkness, units developing their own recognition signals when official codes proved too complex. The American system was louder, less elegant, but it was also more adaptable. In darkness, when plans collapsed and radios failed, the side that could improvise fastest owned the night. The symbolic object that came to represent this transformation was not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but something simpler, the American flashlight. German soldiers used flashlights sparingly, hoarding batteries, treating them as precious resources to be conserved. American troops carried flashlights as casually as cigarettes, waterproof, mass-produced, with batteries so abundant they were discarded half-used. During night operations in Italy, German defenders would sometimes hear American patrols moving through olive groves, the brief red-filtered flash of light as someone checked a map, then darkness again. That casual use of light, the assumption that batteries were infinite, that equipment was expendable, that there would always be more, carried its own psychological weight. It was a small thing, but it represented an ocean of industrial capacity. The Germans conserved light because they had to, the Americans used it freely because they could. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the transformation was complete. The largest amphibious assault in history launched in darkness, with American paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines at midnight, with glider infantry landing in pre-dawn blackness, with infantry wading ashore under the grey light of a clouded dawn. The German defenders, dug into positions they had spent years fortifying, found themselves fighting an enemy that used darkness not as cover for simple infiltration, but as an operational advantage. American bombers struck in the night, guided by pathfinders. American artillery fired time-on-target missions that converged shells from multiple batteries to impact simultaneously in the dark, coordinated by radio nets that functioned when visual signals were impossible. The battlefield that Wehrmacht doctrine had assumed would favor defenders became a space where American material superiority and systemic coordination simply overwhelmed traditional tactical skill. German officers who survived the Normandy campaign and later retreated across France spoke in their debriefs of a particular kind of exhaustion. During the day, they fought against American firepower, the artillery, the air support, the endless supplies. But at night, when armies had traditionally rested and regrouped, the Americans kept coming. Night reconnaissance, night attacks, night supply columns moving forward while German logistics cowered from air attack. The Americans fought a 24-hour war not because their individual soldiers were superior, many German veterans still considered themselves better infantry, but because their system never stopped. The Wehrmacht had built an army that excelled at battles. America had built a military that excelled at continuous operations. In darkness, that systemic advantage became devastating. There is a photograph taken by a German prisoner in January 1945 that captures something of this reality. It shows an American supply depot somewhere in Belgium, photographed at night during the Battle of the Bulge. The depot is illuminated by dozens of floodlights, huge, glaring lights powered by portable generators, turning night into artificial day. Trucks move between supply dumps in steady streams. Forklifts load pallets of ammunition. Soldiers work in shifts around the clock. In the foreground of the photograph, just visible in the shadows beyond the floodlights, 2 German prisoners stand watching, faces blank with exhaustion. The German soldier who took the photograph wrote on the back, in careful script, "Sie haben die Nacht selbst besiegt." They have defeated the night itself. This was the Misjudgment's final revelation. The Americans had not learned to fight in darkness the way Europeans fought. They had changed what darkness meant. They had industrialized the night, flooded it with radios and generators and batteries and lights, transformed it from a realm of stealth and silence into simply another shift in a continuous operation. The German army, for all its tactical excellence, still fought a 19th century war in the dark, soldiers moving quietly, officers whispering commands, units conserving resources against scarcity. America fought a 20th century war that never acknowledged darkness as a limitation at all. By the war's end, the statistics told their own story. American forces in Europe conducted more night operations in the final 6 months of the war than the Wehrmacht conducted in the entire conflict. American night bomber raids over Germany grew so frequent that German civilians spoke of the darkness no longer belonging to them. The Americans had not simply learned night fighting. They had claimed ownership of it through the only method their ideology truly understood: overwhelming application of resources, systematic problem-solving, and the assumption that any limitation could be overcome through proper organization and sufficient supplies. The German officers who survived to witness this transformation, who spent post-war years in POW camps or returned to occupied Germany, carried with them a peculiar kind of trauma. It was not the trauma of defeat alone. Many armies had been defeated. It was the trauma of having their fundamental assumptions revealed as catastrophically wrong. They had believed that warfare was about discipline, tradition, the forge of national character. They had built an ideology around that belief, a political system, and an identity. And they had watched as a nation of businessmen and farmers and factory workers, people they had been taught to despise as soft and materialistic, dismantled their armies through simple, methodical application of organizational principles and industrial abundance. The Americans had not outfought them. The Americans had outproduced them, outsupplied them, and outsystematized them. In the darkness, where European military tradition suggested the disciplined soldier was king, the American system had simply turned on the lights. The epilogue to this misjudgment continues beyond the war itself. In the decades that followed, in Korea and Vietnam, and every conflict since, the American military continued to own the night, through technology, through systems, through the same fundamental approach that had bewildered Friedrich Decker on that Moroccan beach in 1942. Night vision devices, infrared targeting, satellite navigation, all the tools that make modern darkness transparent, they emerged from the same philosophical root, that any limitation is merely a problem waiting for a solution, that abundance can be engineered, that systems properly designed can overcome individual limitations. The Germans had fought as warriors in the dark, the Americans fought as technicians, and in the brutal arithmetic of industrial war, the technicians won. There is something both inspiring and unsettling in this truth. The German officers were not fools, nor were their initial assessments entirely wrong. American troops in 1942 were inexperienced, often poorly prepared for their first battles. But the system that produced them, chaotic, wasteful, democratic, abundant, contained within it a capacity for adaptation and scale that authoritarian efficiency could not match. In the darkness of night operations, where individuals cannot see and control must be distributed, the American faith in systematic organization and decentralized initiative found its perfect expression. The Germans expected warriors. They encountered a military-industrial complex that had learned to schedule darkness like a factory shift. That flashlight, clicked on casually in an Italian olive grove or a French hedgerow, batteries squandered without thought. It was never just a light. It was a philosophy made tangible. It said, "We have so much that we can afford to waste." It said, "Abundance is our weapon." It said, "We do not conquer the darkness through discipline and tradition. We illuminate it, systematize it, and move forward on schedule." The German officers were stunned because they finally understood what they faced. Not just an army, but an entire industrial civilization organized for continuous operation, a system that never slept, never conserved, never accepted darkness as anything more than a logistical challenge to be overcome with sufficient planning and limitless supplies. They had misjudged not just American capability, but American character, the relentless, methodical, supremely confident faith that any problem, even the primal darkness itself, would yield to proper organization and sufficient resources. In that misjudgment lay their defeat.